This is a video about course and gen ed assessment, and in particular about embedding gen ed assessment into course assessment. First thing we're going to do is get the master syllabus for the course that we're going to assess. So in my case, it's Math 197, and I'm going to get the master syllabus from the website here. So I find the simplest way is just to type into the search bar up here, master syllabi or master syllabus, something like that, and just click search. And the first hit that comes up is the list of master syllabi. So I go down to math and find the one I'm looking for. So there it is, Math 197. And then you can download it and save it on your hard drive. So I've done that. I've got it here. And what you want to do is scroll down to the student learning outcomes. And in this case, I've got 6 of them. And I just copied them into a Word doc just to make it a little bit easier to work with. You'll note that you also have your standard of success for course assessment up here. So for all 6 of these outcomes, the standard of success is 75% of students will score 75% or better on, in this case, final exam questions. So the assessment tool is common departmental exam questions. So the master syllabus has all the information that you need in order to do the course assessment. It tells you the tool that you should be using, and then it tells you the standard of success. The one thing that the master syllabus generally doesn't have is the rubric that you're going to use to score the tool. So you'd have to get that from somewhere else. In this case, it says it's a department rubric. So if you're in the math department, you'd get that from the department chair if you don't already have it. All right, so here's my Word doc, and I've just copied the student learning outcomes from the master syllabus here, and I like to color code them because, as you'll see in a few minutes, when I'm entering data into the spreadsheet, it's just a little bit easier for me to find things and to see things if they're color coded. So this is obviously completely optional. I didn't color code the performance indicators. These are the gen ed performance indicators, which are obviously different than the student learning outcomes from the course. And I didn't color code these just because there's only 3 and I kind of ran out of colors here. Now, the Gen Ed performance indicators, honestly, I'm not sure exactly where they are on the web. If you've been doing Gen Ed assessment, you probably already have these. If you haven't done it before, I would ask your department chair for them for your area, or just reach out to somebody on the Gen Ed steering committee, and we can get you that document. So for math, there are 3 performance indicators, and this is what they are. So interpret and draw inferences, etc. So what I need to do is take my tool, in this case, common final exam questions, and then map those questions to both the student learning outcomes and the Gen Ed performance indicators. So up here, I just copied just a brief kind of summary of each of, in this case, the 11 common final exam questions that we use for this course. I color coded the questions according to the student learning outcome. So here are the questions just in numerical order, and then the corresponding student learning outcome. So basically, what you do is you just go through, and if you're using questions, you go through each of the questions and you decide, all right, which student learning outcome does this question assess? So let H be the set, blah, 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 is H a subspace of P3. So I go down and look at my student learning outcomes, and I decide that that assesses number 3, apply the fundamental theorems of linear transformations on vector spaces. And so I say here that final exam question number 1 corresponds to student learning outcome 3, which I have color coded green. So I just made those both green. Okay, so then after I figure out which student learning outcome it corresponds to, then I'm going to figure out which gen ed performance indicator does it correspond to. And so I've decided in this case that it corresponds to number 1, interpret and draw inferences from mathematical models, etc. So I've got my final exam question and then its corresponding student learning outcome and gen ed performance indicator, and I just do that with all the questions. So these are all the various student learning outcomes that I, as the person assessing the course, I decide that these student learning outcomes, that these final exam questions correspond to whichever student learning outcome. Likewise, if I'm doing the gen ed assessment, I would decide which performance indicator best matches the final exam question. Couple of notes here. If you're doing course assessment, you want to make sure that you assess every single student learning outcome. So in the math department, we just use common final exam questions. So our final exam needs to cover all, in this case, six of these student learning outcomes. And course mentors in the math department write the final exam. And we also maintain the syllabus and do the course assessment. So the same person is doing all of this work, and so we have control over it. We make it fit. So if I write a syllabus that has these six student learning outcomes, I want to make sure that I write a final exam that has at least one question for each of these six learning outcomes, so that we can assess all six of them. When you're doing Gen Ed assessment, however, you don't necessarily have to cover all of the performance indicators in any given course. So we generally use more than one course when we're doing Gen Ed assessment. And you'll see here, I've only got a couple of questions that assess number two here, performance indicator number two. Now, if I only had ones and threes in here, that would actually be okay, as long as we had some math course that we were including in our Gen Ed assessment that covered performance indicator number two here. So the moral of the story, or the short version of all of that, is when you're doing assessment for a course, you need to make sure that you cover every single student learning outcome. And if you have just one tool, then obviously that tool, like final exam in this case, needs to hit all of the student learning outcomes. Now I've got 11 questions and only six outcomes, so several of them get hit more than once. Well, that's fine. But you don't have to hit every single Gen Ed performance indicator in every course. Okay, so once I've got this table, then I'm going to collect my data and organize my data. So we'll show you that here. I like to use a spreadsheet. I'm sure there's lots of other ways to do it, but for me, this is the easiest way. So I've got some tabs down here at the bottom, and eventually this is going to have a lot more tabs. I have one tab per section of the course. So I'm starting spring summer 2020. I'm making this video in the summer of 2021. So basically, I'm going to have spring, summer 2020, fall 20, winter 21. Those three semesters will be in this assessment. And then there's multiple sections each semester. So I'll probably end up with maybe 12 to 15 or so tabs, one for each section. So I just have the two that I'm starting with here, sections N2 and N3 from Spring Summer 20. I've got the names of the students here actually written here, but I made the text white for the purposes of this video just so you can't see them. The reason that I include them in my data is that if I ever need to go back and check if maybe there's a mistake or I want to double check, I've got the students' names so that I can go back in Blackboard, because these are all their scores. So this is the question. There are 11 final exam questions. They're not in numerical order, they're in the order of the performance indicators. Just keeps it easier for me to organize. That's one of the reasons why I color code. So it's Roy G. Biv, red to violet, and red to violet, red to violet. Obviously, there's a lot of different ways you can do this, do whatever works best for you. So I've got the students numbered here on the side. For each student, I record their score on the 11 questions. Now, in this case, most of the questions are out of 10 points. Some are number 8, and number 6 here are out of 5 points. And so I go on to Blackboard, which is where these final exams are, and I open up each student's final exam. The questions are randomized, so it is a little bit of work. I've got to just go through and find the questions as I've numbered them here and put in their scores. That's where this comes in really handy. This first question, let H be the set blah, 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 that is not going to be question 1 on most people's final exam. It could be anywhere between 1 and 11, because on Blackboard, the exam questions are randomized. The order is randomized. So this could be number 7 for the first student, and then number 2 for the second student, etc. Basically, I just go through each student's exam top to bottom, and the first question maybe is number 6 here, find the least squares solution, blah, blah, blah. I come over here and I put that score in way over here, and then maybe the second question is number 11, so I put their score in here, and et cetera, et cetera. So fill this in for each student and then go through all the students. Okay, so that's the most work probably of all of this. Especially once you get the spreadsheet set up, that's really the only work. There is some work in setting up the spreadsheet, so let's talk about that. All right, so after this is sort of my raw data here. I have a section for student learning outcomes and gen ed performance indicators. So basically, this is where the assessment of the course is happening, and this is where the gen ed assessment is happening. And it's a little bit complicated in terms of setting it up. I mean, it could be depending on how you feel about this kind of stuff, but once you get it set up, it's just a lot of copying and pasting. So it's really pretty simple after that. All right, so I've got each of my student learning outcomes here, color coded 1 through 6. I've got average score and then success. So let me explain what that is. Average score is the average score for each student for the student learning outcomes here. Now, for student learning outcome number one, solve a system of equations, that's probably the simplest, most basic outcome in this course. So I only have one question in the final exam that tests that or assesses that, and that's question number two. And so this column is really just the score for this column. Likewise, for SLO number two, there's just this one question number 8 that assesses that. So this cell is equal to this cell. And if you click in here, you can see I just type equals and then click this, and it will put in B4 for me. So that's the location of this cell. And then here I click equals and click this cell. So it'll be equals to C4. This one, however, for SLO number 3, there are 5 questions here that cover SLO number 3. Now, as an aside, you might wonder, geez, why do you have so many covering this SLO and so few covering this one? Well, from a previous assessment, I found that students had a lot of trouble with this student learning outcome number 3. These two, they were just nailing it. No problem at all. They were, I mean, as you can see, this one, every single student got 10 out of 10. Basically, if you can't do this by the end of the course, you're going to fail miserably. So this is pretty easy, and they all did it. This one looks like most of the all got that one too. So these are pretty easy. But this one, I think in my previous course assessment, all of the measures of success were met for all the performance indicators except this one, which was quite a bit lower than the others. These 5 were in the 90s, most of them. And then this one was like in the 60s. And I wasn't really aware of that until I did the course assessment. So I redesigned the syllabus actually, and I kind of redid the way I taught the course. And I put a lot more emphasis on this. And I kind of split it up, especially in the final, into a lot more different pieces. And just based on 2 sections so far, the results are a lot better. So students are getting this a lot more. Anyway, that's just an aside about why do I have so many greens and only one red and one orange. So this is the average score of these 5 scores. Now, this student got 100 on their exam. So their average is 10 out of 10. But this student, the second student got a 7.5 and a 6.6 on someone. So their average is 8.82. So this cell is the sum of these divided by 5. So it's literally just the average of these 5 scores. That's my single score that I use for each student to assess that particular student learning outcome. Number 5 has got 2 scores. SLO number 5, questions 9 and 10 cover that one. SLO number 4 is only question 7 on the final, so it's just equal to this cell, and the same thing with number 6. Okay. So I say average score, but really it's only for SLOs 3 and 5 that have more than one final exam question where there's actually an average. The rest are just the actual scores. All right, so those are my average scores. And now what I need to do is decide if the standard of success is met. Let me go back really quick to the syllabus. So here on the syllabus under student learning outcomes, standard of success used is 75% of students will score 75% or better. So this 75% isn't coming into play yet. We're looking at this 75%. And these are different numbers. This number doesn't have to be the same as this number, meaning they measure different things or they refer to different things. It's common that they're the same, and they're the same in this case. But right now we're focusing on this number and 75% or better. So I'm looking at these scores and I want to change them into percents and then compare them to 75%. This is 10 out of 10, 5 out of 5, 10 out of 10, 10 out of 10, etc. This is 5 out of 5. This is 8.82 out of 10. So that'd be 88.2%, 7.5 out of 10. So that's 75%. And this is 5 out of 5. So that's 100%. The percents are here coded as a success or a failure. Okay, so the reason that they're coded as a success or failure is because that's what I need to do to get this number to compare for this first number over here. So let's look at this first one and look at how I do this in a spreadsheet. What I'm going to do is compare this score to 7.5. 7.5 out of 10 corresponds to 75%. So I just use a little logical formula here in Excel. And for now, I'm not going to go into details of how to use Excel. I assume people can figure that out. I'm not a huge power user. I just look around on here and poke around and figure things out. And if I can't figure it out, I ask Google, and usually I have an answer in 5 minutes. So I use this conditional if function. Basically, what it says is if a cell N4, so that's this one, is greater than or equal to 7.5, then put a 1 here. That's what the 1 here means. And then if not, put a 0. Okay. So basically, this cell is going to be a 1 if this cell is 75% or higher. And then this cell is going to be a 1 if this cell is 75% or higher. Well, 75% of 5 is 3.75. So if this number is 3.75 or higher, then this number is going to be a 1. Otherwise, it's going to be a 0. And I do the same thing for the other student learning outcomes here to turn it into a success or a failure. So a success is a 1 here. A failure, this is statistics lingo. We're not saying the student has failed or succeeded or whatever. A failure is a 0. So for this one, the average for student number 8 on SLO number 3, which corresponds to these 5 questions, their average was 7.32. So that's less than 7.5. So that is a failure. So there's a 0 here. Okay. The way that we would read this row, say for student number 8 here, is they met the standard of success for SLOs 1, 2, 4, and 5, and they failed or did not meet the standard of success for SLOs 3 and 6. Okay. So for number 6, their average is 3.3. Okay. I've got raw data, final exam scores for all of my students. Then I translated that into one single score for each student learning outcome for each student, which I've then translated into a success or failure based on my measure of success in the master syllabus. This second number here, they'll score whatever or better, in this case, 75%. Okay, now what do I do with all this success failure data? Well, now I want to look at this first number. I want to compare each student learning outcome to this number. So 75% of all the students, in this case, all the students in the section, but really it's going to be all the students in your sample. And I'll get to that in a little bit. But for now, just to be able to compare section to section, I'm just going to look at this section SS20N2. And what I'm going to do is add up all the successes and divide by the total number of students. So I just have this column here. There's a fancier function in Excel called count that will sort of count things up, but I didn't really remember the syntax of it. So it was just easier for me to make a column here and copy a bunch of ones that I called count, and this just literally counting the number of students. So this is just a 1 for every single student. And then down here, I add them all up. So this is the sum of Z4 all the way down to Z30. So there are 27 students. Down here, I have the totals of all the successes. This one is the sum of T4 down to T30, okay, as you can see up here. And these likewise are the sums of their corresponding columns. So this orange one is the sum of the orange column, green one is the sum of the green column, etc. So this is the number of successes out of 27. And then these are the proportions. 27 out of 27, obviously that's a 1. 26 out of 27 is 0.96. These are rounded to 2 decimal places. 25 out of 27 is 0.93, etc. 19 out of 27 is 0.7. All right, and these are the numbers that I am now going to compare to 75%, okay, or 0.75 since these are decimals. I can see here that these 5 student learning outcomes succeeded, or the standard of success was met for these 5. Each of these numbers is bigger than 0.75. But this one, for this section, student learning outcome number 6, the standard of success was not met. Only 70% of students scored 75% or higher on student learning outcome number 6. Okay, to summarize this last part here, every student gets a 1 or a 0 here, depending on whether they scored 75% or higher on each of these corresponding student learning outcomes. And then I add up all the ones and I figure out in my whole section what proportion of the entire section scored 75% or higher. Here, 100% scored 75% or higher on outcomes 1 and 2, 96% scored 75% or higher on outcome 3, etc. And only 70% scored 75% or higher on outcome 6. Okay, so this is the sort of summary of the student learning outcomes for this section. All right, so now here are the gen ed assessment results. I've got average score again for each of the three. There's only three performance indicators. So remember back over here, I've mapped each final exam question to a corresponding gen ed performance indicator. And I use this mapping to create the formulas in these cells. So for example, gen ed performance indicator number 1 here corresponds to, let's see, this one, these three, this one, and this one. So it's questions 1, 3, 5, and 11. Well, that's basically, those are all the green ones. That's student learning outcome number 3. Okay. I've got each student learning outcome mapped to a performance indicator. And actually, I've got that down here separately. It's not surprising, probably, that every question that corresponds to a particular student learning outcome also corresponds to a particular performance indicator. It doesn't have to be that way, probably, but it's probably not surprising. In other words, solving a system of linear equations, okay, well, that I said is employing quantitative methods. So every question that would be related to solving a system of equations would also be related to employing quantitative methods. So every question that hits SLO number 1 is going to hit gen ed performance indicator number 3, which is what I've got here. All right, so basically what I need to do is get all the questions for SLOs 3 and 4 and average those all together. So 3 is the green and 4 is the blue. So that's these 6 questions here. So I'm going to add these together and divide by 6, and that's going to give me this number. Now that would be average score. I'm a little bit inconsistent here. I actually use the scores here, and here it's more like a proportion. I should really say average proportion here. So I divided by 60 instead of by 6. So instead of a 10, this is going to be a 1. And then these are proportions that I can compare to 0.75. Okay, now a caveat here, something to watch out for is it may be tempting to say, well, just average these two together because this is the average of the greens, this is the average of the light blues, and you want to average the greens and the light blues. So just average these two. The short story is if you take an average of averages, that's not the same thing as averaging all of the data together. In this particular case, it is because these are all tens. But you can work it out if you write out the formula, for the mean, add up all the numbers and divide by the number of the numbers. If you average means, you will get a different number than if you take the average of the entire data set. Okay, so always use the raw data when you're computing the average scores. Okay, so this one is the average of the data for SLOs 3 and 4, because those are the ones that correspond to performance indicator number 1. Performance indicator number 2, well, that corresponds to just SLO number 5. Okay, just SLO number 5. And so this is just equal to the average score for SLO number 5. Now, in this case, it's okay to use to make this cell be equal to this cell because this cell is only including the data from questions 9 and 10, which correspond to SLO number 5. And then for performance indicator number 3, that corresponds to SLOs 1, 2, and 6. So here I need to get all the data for 1, 2, and 6. So it's the sum of this one, and this one, which if I click here, you can see those are the cells here. And then I'm divided by 20 because questions 8 and 6 are worth 5 points each. Question 2 is worth 10, so it's a total of 20 points. And you can see it's kind of handy, just convenient that this first student happened to get 100% on all the questions. And so they should have a 1, ones across the board here and here. All right, so then here, same kind of conditional formula. If this score is 0.75 or bigger, then this is a 1. So here's the formula for that. Same thing for performance indicator number 2. If this score is 0.75 or bigger, this is a 1. If not, this is a 0. Okay, for the next section, N3, it's just the same. And what I did is I just copied this sheet. So down here, if you right click on it, you can, do move or copy. And I just copied the sheet and then renamed it and then deleted the data here and the students. But these formulas that I put in here are all there. So once I set this sheet up, all I had to do for the next section is go into Blackboard and put in the raw data. And once I put in the raw data here, all of these numbers populated, as well as all these numbers down here. So I didn't talk about these. So this is the same idea as the success proportions for student learning outcomes for the course assessment. This is the total number of students that had a success for each of the Gen Ed performance indicators, and then this is the proportion. For the next section, here's my percentages, and it's really interesting. They all met the standard of success for the student learning outcomes, and in particular, number 6. This is almost 90% here, whereas in the first section, they were only at 70%. They met 1 through 5, but for number 6, they were only at 70%. But for the performance indicators for Gen Ed, they were all at 100%, whereas for this section that did better on learning outcome number 6, they didn't do as well on the performance indicators. I mean, they still did quite well, but they were at a 96% for performance indicator number 1 instead of 100%. So one student had a 0 here for performance indicator number 1. They were at 58% instead of 75%. Okay, extend that, do the same thing for all the other sections. So to create the next section, I'm going to copy this sheet to another one, delete the data, clear the data and the names, and then put in the new names and all the data. And then this and all this is just done automatically. Then the last thing that I'm going to do is I've created this summary. And actually, I've already set this up. So this is just going to get filled in as well. For the entire sample of however many 12 or 15 sections I'm going to have, I'm going to calculate proportions, success proportions across the entire sample. So I'm not going to average sections. I'm going to consider all the students in all of the sections as one big pot, one big sample. To compute these totals and these proportions for the SLOs and the performance indicators, it's very similar to what I did for each section, except I'm going to add across all the sections. Right now, with only 2 sections, what I'm going to do for the proportion, the overall proportion for SLO number 1, is add the totals across all sections. So I'm going to add this number, and then I go to the next sheet and I add this number, and then I'm going to divide by the total number of students in both sections. Now, it's just a coincidence these 2 sections both had 27 students. So when I'm coming here, the total is 27 plus 27. And then my count here is just going to be across all the sections. Across those 2 sections, it's 54. So this is 54 divided by 54. So B5, this number, divided by this number. And as I add sections, this number, and this is kind of a fancy way to sum across sheets, and I had to ask Google about that. It was pretty easy. So this number is just going to add up this cell in every single sheet. And since I'm copying sheets, it's going to be in the same location, Z35. So when I come back over here, you can see it's referring to Z35, and then these are the names of the sheets. And the syntax, ask Google about the syntax if you don't already know. I certainly didn't. As I add sheets, these numbers are just going to get updated. I'm adding the total number of successes for all 6 performance indicators across all sections, and then dividing by the total number of students in all sections to get my proportions. Okay, I hope that is helpful, and it's a little bit of work, but once you set it up, it goes pretty smoothly, and it just boils down to data entry.